Hello, modern American students. We are going to start talking about 9/11 and the War on Terror, and we'll talk about some of the events that led up to 9/11. And one of the first events to know about goes all the way back to 1990. Some of your parents probably remember this a little bit, or maybe a lot. Maybe some of them even served during this time period. But if we go back, it's 1990, it's in the Middle East. The country of Iraq was mad about oil prices. They thought that Kuwait and some other countries were kind of ripping them off and raising the price of oil prices, and Iraq didn't like that. Felt their oil wasn't as worth as much then, and that type of thing. And so they decide they're going to invade Kuwait. And Iraq invades Kuwait, and they threaten some of the other countries in the region: Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. And the United States trades with these countries, especially for, mainly for oil. And we put together a group of countries, a coalition of countries, and we are going to go in and drive the Iraq army out of Kuwait. So we are going to go to war. This was the leader of Iraq. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was the dictator from 1979 to 2003, and he was a bad person. He had used poisonous gas on some of his own people, especially the Kurds in northern Iraq. He had used gas on them. Anybody that maybe spoke out about his government was never seen again. That type of thing. I was a little kid back in the 90s, and what I can remember is Saddam Hussein was basically the worst person in the world. That's how we viewed him. You had Hitler, number one worst person of all time, and Saddam Hussein number two. Now that's probably really not how the rankings go as far as worst people of all time, but Saddam Hussein was a bad person, and in the 90s, that's really how we viewed him. Saturday Night Live made fun of him. South Park made fun of him, and so you had a lot of different groups making fun of Saddam Hussein. But he was on the news all the time. People were worried about him. But we're talking 1990. So even after this war in 1990, he's going to continue going for another 13 years. This was our president at the time, President George H.W. Bush. And he had been the vice president throughout the 80s under President Reagan, and then he became president in 1988. And so he's one of the guys that decides, yep, we are going to go and drive Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. We're going to go help. They called it Operation Desert Storm. All right, and it was the Gulf War. War waged by coalition forces, so many more than just the United States. Forces from 35 different nations, but we were in charge, and we fought. It took a while. It took parts of 1990 to mobilize and get everything over there, but we really start bombing and invading in January 17th of 1991. And you can see it's a pretty quick war. January 17th to February 28th. All right, a little more than a month to complete our objectives. You look at the amount of soldiers killed in action. The United States, we lost 146 soldiers in that month and a half. Senegal lost 92, and you see over there it's an accident. A plane crashed. And it was I believe it was a Saudi plane. The United Kingdom lost 47, Saudi Arabia 24, France 9, United Arab Emirates 6, Qatar 3, Syria 2, Egypt 11, Kuwait 1. And then you see enemy action. That's when the enemy shoots us down or kills us. And then an accident. Some of this is friendly fire, where you're shooting at or bombing your own people by accident. So you can see, on the other hand, over 25,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed in the war. Some numbers have them closer to 50,000. One of the things I remember as a little kid when I would see the news and see pictures in the newspaper are our soldiers wearing gas masks. That's one of the things that Saddam Hussein did. Is he had He had his scientists in his factories making poisonous gas. And sometimes he would use this on his own people. And of course, our troops were then ready. We had our gas masks to protect us. Thought this was a cool one, this battleship, when the cannons are all firing off. Probably got targets on shore. Just all the fire coming out. Now, after the coalition forces drove the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, a decision had to be made. Do we invade Iraq or not? And the decision was no. As long as they listen to United Nations Security Council's, their rules, we won't invade. And it was, hey, the thought was if we invade, we're going to lose a lot more people, a lot more soldiers. And we also placed economic sanctions on Iraq, and they had to allow United Nations inspectors into their factories to make sure that they were not making weapons of mass destruction, poisonous gas, or anything like that. So you might say, okay, well, what does the Gulf War, what does Desert Storm have to do with 9/11? Because there's not a lot of connections right away. Right? Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda was primarily Saudi Arabians. Well, Saudi Arabia was on our side during the Iraq War of 1990. So what's the connection? Also, where did they plan their attack? Afghanistan, also nowhere really near Iraq. So what's the connection? Well, when when Saudi Arabia was being threatened by Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Osama bin Laden offered his services to Saudi Arabia and said, I can drive him out of Kuwait. He said, we just got done fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. He goes, I can get the Mujahideen going. We can build an army. We can do it the same way we did it in Afghanistan, only we're going to do it in Kuwait. And Saudi Arabia says, thanks, but no thanks. We have a better offer from the USA and the Western coalition. Osama bin Laden did not like that. He believed that it should be a war Muslim against Muslim, not Muslims against Westerners. He saw this kind of like the Crusades, where Europeans came in and attacked the Holy Land and attacked Muslims, and then he also saw, you have the United States and Great Britain and France using Saudi Arabia as a military base. The two holiest cities in all of Islam are located in Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina, and he did not like this, that that the Westerners were here. They weren't just killing Iraqi soldiers. He viewed it as, they're killing Muslims. And even though he wanted to do the same thing, he viewed it as a whole different thing. So this was one of the things that really angers Osama bin Laden and helps Al Qaeda grow. After 9/11, he sends a letter to um, basically puts it out on the internet, puts it out in the media, and lists things like U.S. troops that had been in Saudi Arabia and the sanctions against Iraq after the war. He didn't like that. Other conflicts had been going on in places like Somalia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Lebanon. And he didn't like the way Muslims were being treated there. Same thing in Chechnya and in the Kashmir region of India slash Pakistan, depending on who you talk to. He didn't like how they were being treated there, and also the U.S. support of Israel. We were going to talk more about that, but we didn't really get to, where a lot of people, a lot of Muslims might view Israel as stealing land from the Palestinian Arabs, and they don't like that. And so the U.S. has supported Israel throughout the years, and that's another thing that he listed. So these are the things that he's listing that he doesn't like, and it kind of starts off with U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, the sanctions against Iraq, and so on. And he's going to build throughout the 1990s. There's going to be some smaller terrorist attacks. There was an embassy in Kenya that was bombed. But really, I'm telling you, in the 90s, the average American did not know who Osama bin Laden was. Everybody knew who Saddam Hussein was. I mean, nobody really knew who Osama bin Laden was. I remember seeing something in the mid 90s on TV, about him, and it was something that you just didn't pay attention to because it just didn't seem like it was going to be that big of a deal. It wasn't going to hit home. It hits home on September 11th, 2001. I can remember very well. I was a senior in high school. I was sitting in class, and one of the kids that walks, you know how you get those kids that they take a pass out every single hour and kind of take a tour of the school. Well, one of those kids came back to our room and was like, "Yeah, hey, one of the twin towers, a plane flew into it in New York," and most people just thought, "Hey, it's probably an accident." All right, September 11th, 2001, a plane a big passenger plane flies into one of the towers. Most people at the beginning thought it must be an accident. Where did this take place? The planes crashed in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. So 4 planes were hijacked. A lot of times we forget about the 4 planes because we usually think twin towers. All right, you can see the first plane leaves Massachusetts, comes back, and hits the twin towers. Same with the second plane. The third plane is leaving New Jersey. No, not New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and comes back, and it is going to hit the Pentagon. The fourth plane leaves New Jersey, and the thought was it was going to come back and hit either the White House or the Capitol building. And it crashes before it gets there. Flight 93, they've made movies about it. Cell phones were fairly new. Not everybody had a cell phone, but enough people were getting cell phones. It wasn't like the 90s when only rich people had cell phones. Now, a lot more average people had cell phones by 2001, but it was probably more like 40 or 50% of the population, not like 99 like today. And anyway, people were on their cell phones on the plane, finding out this was happening, and they decided to take the plane back. And I think I've got some stuff on that later that we'll talk about. So the first plane hits the first tower at 8:46 a.m. Like I said, when we were finding out about it, we thought it was an accident. Get to the next class or whatever, and word is a second plane had hit. And once again, it's not like today where we all have smartphones. It's not like today where we all have a computer in front of us. Even the teachers with a computer in front of them, it's not like things bounce up on the screen like it does today. Like if you're on Google, something would show up. That didn't happen back then. You literally probably back then had to turn the TV on to see something, and we did have TVs in the room, but they weren't on all the time. And I can remember one of the teachers turning the TV on, and we were watching stuff. And now, of course, it's not an accident when the second plane hits at 9:03. So we had about a 15-minute span there where we knew about it, and then the second plane hit. And I think I didn't see it, but I know there were kids in school. They had the TV on when the second plane hit, and they were watching it on the TV in a classroom. Here's, because people are looking at it, it's smoking, taking pictures. Here comes the second plane. So now we know it's not an accident. A little bit later, a third plane hits the Pentagon, which is the head of our nation's security, head of our defense in Washington, D.C. It's a big building. It hits one of the sides. People were killed in this area. A little bit different, though, than, say, the trade tower, where you have to get down a long ways to get out of there. Here, if you're on a different side of the building, you can get out. So at this point, at 10:03, a fourth plane crashes in a field in Pennsylvania. Once again, we don't know, is this related or not? Planes don't crash very often, so most people believe, yes, it has to be related, but why did it land in the field? And that's when the passengers tried to take the plane back and it crashed. And so there was, I believe, at least one Minnesotan Minnesotan on the plane that tried to take it back. I believe he was from Apple Valley. There might have been more. So at this point, we're kind of scared. You know, how many planes are up there that are hijacked? Nobody knew. People weren't sure, like, hey, I have relatives around the country, or I might have a parent that's flying, or people didn't know. It's not like we have cell phones where we can start texting people. It's not like we had cell phones where we could um, check in on Facebook, marking ourselves safe or something like that. Um, people were worried. I remember I didn't have a feeling of being that worried because I didn't have any. I knew where my family members were at, but there were definitely people that were anxious, and especially probably you think about the millions of people around the country that didn't know where their relatives were. So at 9:59, the South Tower falls. After burning for 56 minutes, the North Tower collapses at 10:28 after burning for 102 minutes. And I can remember these scenes watching on TV where people are running down the street, the clouds of smoke and debris and everything is crashing after them. So in total, there were 2,996 deaths, and that includes the 19 hijackers. So in total, there were 2,977 victims. That includes the people on the planes. That includes the people that were in the towers in the Pentagon, and it also includes the first responders that were there, the firemen, the paramedics that were there trying to get people out. So here's the hijackers. Where were most of them from? Well, 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia, a country we really feel is our ally, right? We trade with them. Now, these weren't people working for the government, they were terrorists. The United Arab Emirates, 2, Lebanon, and Egypt. So there were 19 hijackers. What did they use to hijack the plane? Well, basically box cutters. Things that you can't get on a plane today, but maybe 20 years ago, it just didn't seem like a big deal to bring something like this on there. When you look at the firemen down here. This shows you how big of an area this is. They're digging through rubble, getting people out. 341 firefighters who went into the building died, 21 policemen and 2 paramedics trying to rescue people. President George Bush, we saw his father yesterday. He's the president, and earlier. He was the president. He gives a speech, basically, we're going to find out who did it. We're going to go get them. This was possibly the 20th hijacker. I think it was Zacarias Moussaoui. He was arrested in Minnesota. He was taking flight classes. He actually was born in France. He's a citizen of France. He was taking flight classes, learning how to fly, but they were suspicious because he never asked how to land. And he ends up being arrested for illegal immigration on August 16th. And he doesn't say, like, yeah, we're planning an attack, and nobody really suspected an attack like that. They really didn't know what he was doing here. And so then when it happens, okay, they had a better idea what was going on. And this is going to lead to the war on terror that we'll talk about a little bit tomorrow when we talk about the Iraq war, the second Iraq war and the war in Afghanistan. And I will have a couple video links for you to look at, and then you can fully complete the note sheet.